Okay, well, welcome everyone. Thanks to this special Friday edition of VMACS. I know that, given lots of religious obligations today, we're glad that everyone that can make it. Just a quick reminder of the rules of the game. No abusive behavior will be tolerated. We reserve the right to remove anyone from the webinar if we think you're engaging in abusive behavior. Our moderator today will be Stefania Albanese, and she will deal with the live Q&A at the end of the talk. The co-authors will be answering questions via text along the way. And just so you know, your video will be turned off at all times. We will not unmute your mics either. We will, in the Q&A, give you the ability to unmute yourself, but it will be always up to you to unmute your mic if you want to participate. And just a reminder that this webinar is being live streamed on YouTube. So without further ado, Stefania, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you, Kurt. So welcome everyone to this edition of VMACS. So Lone Smith is going to present actually two papers, one on the behavioral serum model with application to the swine flu epidemic, and the second for whom the bell tolls avoidance behavior at the breakout in COVID-19. And these projects have a number of co-authors who are also online and will be answering questions, including Jussi Käppo, Elena Corcioli, Mariana Kudliak, and Andrea Wilson. So just as a reminder, the first 60 minutes, Loans is going to speak. You can ask clarifying questions in the Q&A, and then we'll open up the floor for questions. So Loans, the floor is yours.
Okay, yeah, so I'm Lonas, and on the map there, you can see green circles for UC in Singapore, who might well be asleep now, Elena at UTGRV, Mariana in San Francisco at the Fed, Andrea at Princeton. And there's a delay here, so let me get on. The paper is one on a topical issue that I've been into for a while, so let me just discuss, first of all, the problem here, which is that everything to do with contagions turns on science, biology, how infectious diseases are. It turns on sociology. I was talking to my co-author, Giuseppe Mascarini, and he was talking about super spreaders in Italy, in the hospitals, being a major route. It turns on geography and the density of cities. It turns on culture, the fact that, in Italy, people meet and often will kiss rather than do handshakes, and it turns on game theory, and I do game theory. And game theory is how we react to each other and to payoffs that change. And it turns on political economy, as we're discovering, which is how fast action can happen at the macro level. So I'm going to focus on game theory, because these payoffs often can be changing radically. The actions of other people can be changing rapidly. So let me first of all give you the background. There's three types of epidemiological models that are relevant here. The susceptible infected model, for instance, herpes, once you've got it, you've got it. The SIS model, once you've got it, you're susceptible, you're infected, and then you're susceptible again. That's a common cold. And then there's the ones that you can recover from, SIR, susceptible, infected, and then recovered. And we're kind of hoping that this is of the latter flavor. I'm going to discuss that, but the intuitions that are offered here are actually applicable for all three of these settings here. Okay, so the SIR model first arose in 27, and there were modifications of it very quickly thereafterwards. Imagine that this is happening in periods 1, 2, 3, 4, but a lot of the analysis works for differential equations. You've got to say a large continuum of people, and they are in one of three states. They are either susceptible, and I'm going to use the notation sigma for the mass of people who are susceptible in the interval 0 to 1. And if they get infected, they hope not to, they transition into the infected state, and I'll use the notation pi for the mass of people who are infected. And they could be infected and contagious, but also oblivious to the fact. They could be asymptomatic, or they could be symptomatically so. And I'm going to start off agnostic about those two cases a little bit. And then they are removed or they are recovered, depending upon whether they die or they get better. And at that point, they're immune, either because they're not around anymore or because really they are immune. Okay, so let's also use the reference to the infected share as the prevalence. That's often what people refer to it as. So if you can infect other people, then you're in the prevalence. And people who are infected in this model go around and infect people at a fixed rate beta. And the word fixed is critical here. And there is therefore, and herein we skip over all of the sociology that Giuseppe was talking about, and we just assume completely random pairwise meetings. So people are meeting from these two pools that have masses sigma and pi. Clearly the mass of such meetings is proportional to the product under that independence assumption. And there's going to be a total mass or inflow incidence, beta sigma pi of new infected cases. And then people in the SIR model will recover at some fixed rate R. So altogether, this leaves us with a differential equation for a three-dimensional system, sigma, which is growing, which is falling, I should say, as people catch the disease and they appear as incidents, that number falls. The incidence or the infected numbers grows because of inflows, and this is a stock flow model. And here's why I also got into it, because it's a search and matching flavor. There's an inflow, beta sigma pi, and then there's an outflow of the recoveries. And then if you wanted to, you could track the recoveries, rho. Turns out that it doesn't play a role in the model, so often the equations are formally just two-dimensional. So you can see that the susceptible is always going down. The infected has two forces. These two forces tend to make it rise and then fall. And I said we can safely work pi, I meant rho. Okay, and so then the end game is that this thing dies out. When does it die out? It dies out when this share of people who can be infected is low enough. Equivalently, the share who are immune is high enough. And so this is where we talk about the herd immunity. There comes a tipping point where inflow equals outflow. In search and matching models, inflow equals outflow is the name of the game everywhere. But in these SIR models, it happens at one moment in time when we have balance. And the balance equation is very sweet, you can see. And the pi's cancel. And you can deduce that as long as the susceptibles is below a certain threshold, poof, the contagion goes away. There's another way that this has been formulated by people, and it's in terms of something called an R0. If you just imagine someone who is infected, he's going to be infected until he recovers. So that's an expected time 1 over R, and he's infecting people at a rate beta. So he's infecting beta over R people, if indeed every person he met was susceptible. If every person you meet is not susceptible, then we get the herd immunity 101 formula, which is that as long as R0 times sigma, it falls below 1, then we're good, and we passed herd immunity. Now, just to show you how newsworthy this is, there was a published estimate for COVID recently that R0 was 2.3. I went Googling it myself about 3 weeks ago. What's R0? It's 2.3, or it was 2.28. And so you get, oh, rho is bigger than 0.56. And then I'm reading March 19th, the headline, this is in Newsweek, Governor Newsom of California predicts 56% of Californians be infected in 8 weeks without mitigation effort. I want you to believe that that's bullshit. And that's part of the message here. Okay, so let's get back to this. Why is it bullshit? Because incentives matter, game theory matters. Okay, so this paper will focus on H1N1, for which we have data, and later turn to COVID-19, for which we have data, and show that that's wrong and give you the correct story. Okay, so we're going to ignore geography and culture because those are not changing during the course of these contagions. They are kind of specific fixed effects for the different countries. And in swine flu, there was no political economy either. There was no serious public actions that emerged. Okay, so we don't have to worry about that either. And that political side is new for COVID-19, which is complicating the analysis towards the end. Okay, so just to see the difference between why incentives matter. Imagine someone goes with measles to Disneyland and they start infecting people, and often you'll have outbreaks. And they'll say measles has some insanely high R0, way over 10. But that's because people weren't expecting it, okay? So how you behave in a pandemic when you've seen this train coming down the track for a while is totally different than how you're going to behave if you're caught off guard, okay? And this is why you can see incredibly why the epidemiologists are missing the boat on game theory. So we're going to focus on strategic behavior because it can turn on a dime and it can change very rapidly. Okay, so the bottom line here is that we are not animals. This thing is passing among Homo economicus, and Homo economicus has been very good in the past at re-optimizing. You know, we created quarantines during the Black Plague because we realized that that would slow down the action. AIDS totally changed the course, I understand, of sexual interactions. That the whole safe sex movement was really an AIDS effect. People were always shifting to condoms. They were checking their partner's history. In general, we think that doing actions like covering your hands during flu, etc., that matters. Okay, so here's the background. We're not the first to think of this. Thomas Philipson was there early on in the 90s, and he has a paper with Goffard that I was just rereading last night. It's interesting, exploring HIV/AIDS when people can actually decide on their partners, decide to withdraw from matching, etc. I'm probably misstating the results, but essentially it was a private optimization model that was very sweetly done. It's a quick paper to read. I got into this by work with Elena on the economics of counterfeiting. We started off in 2004, and before long, we were analyzing counterfeiting. Counterfeit money, you're handed something that you really wished you weren't handed, a bad note. And it has the property that when you hand someone your bad $100 bill, you lose it as you hand it to them. And so in the course of our conversations, it wasn't long before we realized, you know, there's another situation with the public goods version of counterfeit money, which is contagion, where when you hand someone something bad, you retain it when you hand it to them. And so we wrote a paper, Contagious Matching Games. We actually, it was only presented once. I presented it at the Penn S&M conference in the fall 2006. We then thought, oh, we should take this to data. So we started off getting lots of data on HIV/AIDS. Serious data is really hard to get. Elena knows the story there. And then swine flu hit, 2009. And this was, I thought, this was the pandemic of the occasion. Let's do the application here because there's going to be tremendous variation. We can finally identify these things. The problem with counterfeiting is that the chances of getting counterfeit notes are really super teeny tiny, like one in 10,000. But here, people are going to be faced with much higher odds of getting sick. So we reoriented the analysis there towards explaining the swine flu epidemic. It has taken a lot of time to get all the data on board, and I'm not in on that end of the story. I'm just trying to make excuses for why basically a paper started in one pandemic is going to finish in another. And then Philip Kircher, who invited us to that talk, he later ended up writing a paper that came out just last year on the HIV/AIDS epidemic, more or less an equilibrium version of the original Philipson paper, just like we were thinking of trying to do an equilibrium version of his and modify the SIR model. Okay, so here's the framework. We've got a contagion game, and this contagion game is literally the biggest game in the world. Everybody in the world is a player in this game, okay? I don't see the time here, by the way. I wish I had a timestamp on, oh, here it is, 11:14. Okay, so the stakes, payoff, you have to, in order to describe a game, you have to say who are the players, who are the stakes. The stakes are the highest stakes, live or die, or maybe you're getting sick. So let's call it a loss L. And the actions are the vigilance that you take, okay? So I want to show how these actions matter. So I'm going to introduce something, and this was the device of the paper. There's a filter function that translates your vigilance, which will eventually be subtracted from your payoffs, into reducing the probabilities. So higher vigilance will scale down these passage chances more. And thus, because people you meet are also going to be scaling down their passage chances, we're going to have that the passage rate scales by f of v if I'm doing if I'm say someone who is contagious, and I'm using vigilance V, and F of W if he's using vigilance W. So there's two actions here. This is a strategic setting. This function F starts off at 1. So no vigilance, this thing is passing just like no actions were happening. Infinite vigilance, this thing is not passing. Standard diminishing returns. So think of a mask. There's a lot of debates about whether or not they're more self-protective or other protective. We're going to be assuming symmetry here. Think of not going to a meeting. That symmetrically protects both of you. So this can either capture reducing the meeting rate or being more careful in the meetings that you do go to. And this multiplicative form is obviously a great simplification. Turned out for auto accidents, you need a submodular form or log submodular form, so I'm not going to do that. The best form of vigilance is getting a vaccination, okay? And that gives you nearly perfect vigilance. And so that is going to be something that is going to be the end game that we're hoping for this particular disease. Okay, here's a great function, the hyperbolic function. It has all those properties, and it's going to have really nice properties. So we're just going to go with this. So if you think about this property, this thing, if zeta is really large, it translates your vigilance into a high reduction. So essentially 1 over zeta is the contagiousness. Gamma more or less has a interpretation of responsiveness or an elasticity, but I'll call it responsiveness because I want to use the word elasticity in a second, or the proportion of fall in the passage rate. And this, I believe, should actually vary by cities. There's some observations we have here that we haven't yet checked out in the data, but I think you should be more responsive in cities because it's easier to have a massive reduction in your meeting rates by changes in your actions. Okay. So here is the framework now. The infection rate is your passage rate times the prevalence. And now we are now changing the passage rate. So let's assume that you're unsure. You're in this middle ground, you're asymptomatic, you could be infected, you might not. Most likely you're not infected. So there's some chance Q that you're gonna scale on this infection chance. And altogether we've got a very nice formula for the chance that you get infected when you meet someone. If you think everyone else is using a vigilance V-bar, now I want to use Nash equilibrium, and I want to find the V that closes the loop here. So everyone has a loss function, quasi-linear preferences. So there's an infection chance times a loss plus the actual vigilance costs you incur. You can use marginal analysis because we've set it up so that there's diminishing returns. We are going to be assuming complete information, and obviously to maximize or minimize your losses, you need to know the prevalence, you need to know the losses. So it'd be terrible if public authorities ever lowballed those things. So that's why we want to absolutely assume that these are apprised of by all the agents in the model. Take optimality conditions, basically marginal benefit equals marginal cost. And the marginal benefits increase with the losses, they increase with the prevalence. This is a game of strategic substitutes. The more the other people are washing their hands, the more careful that you can be. And that affects things too. So I'm gonna assume you guys understand a little bit about the economics of strategic substitutes, but let me just point out here that you got diminishing returns, obviously. So higher vigilance means there's a higher marginal benefit at the margin for, that's circular. But if others' vigilance falls, then your marginal benefit schedule shifts up. So, that's the key thing here. So we look for a Nash equilibrium in this world. Everybody's choosing the same vigilance. We're all best replies. We have decreasing best reply functions that are illustrated here. And we look for this Nash equilibrium, which is the crossing point in this particular world. And let me point out that there, because it's a game of strategic substitutes, there is and kind of an underreaction, because your immediate reaction to an increase in prevalence is to have more vigilance. That's the upward shift in the green curve. Your best response function goes up. But the other person does that too. He gets more careful too. And so then your response is not so strong. So this picture is in the background. If you understand game theory, you would have seen these pictures before. I'm going to go on just back to that, how it impacts the map. Okay, so f prime of 0 is finite. this changes everything. This is a problem. This is a nice consumer theory optimization problem where there's a corner solution. And if you fall below the background risk, you are just not inputting any vigilance at all. Okay. So this is going to cause a regime shift that's going to happen in this game where not only at zero vigilance by everyone else, but if the vigilance is low enough, you're just not, it's just not worth your cost benefit analysis to do any vigilance. But above a threshold, and we give the threshold here in the slides, and we'll make the slides available afterwards. It's a very nice game. It can be solved by undergraduates. Above this particular threshold, you are going to start inputting your vigilance. You're going to be using your marginal analysis there. And when you start inputting your vigilance, you can input that, all those, input your optimal vigilance back into original function. We get a very nice relationship for how the filter responsiveness changes in response to everything. So there's going to be a critical exponent phi in the paper. And you can see here that it is, we're going to have two regimes. Below a threshold of prevalence pi bar, everyone's chill. This is like the standard SIR model. But above a threshold pi lower bar, people are being vigilant. And this vigilance causes the infection chance not to rise linearly in proportion to the number of people infected. And that's the signature of the SIR model. And thus the passage rate, I see I'm missing a couple. I meant to multiply each of those terms. Oh, no, yeah, I divided each. Okay, good. The infection chance is scaling up less than linearly. The passing rate, in fact, is falling as we get over the threshold. People are vigilant because they don't want to catch this stuff as easily. Ta-da! So now, in the model, we have derived something called the behavioral SIR model. The behavioral SIR model is going to involve two regimes. There will be one regime up until some threshold pi lower bar. And I should point out that pi lower bar, it will respond to all of the parameters in the model that we have, how bad the disease is. For instance, a very bad disease is going to cause this threshold to go down. And people are going to start being more vigilant. And this should ring true if you think of how you behave during flu season and how you behave during flu season. If they say, you hear the news announcement in the morning that, oh my goodness, things are really up. So that cutoff responds to all the parameters of the model. If it becomes more infectious, it actually goes up because your actions are more fruitless. But if it becomes more responsive, it changes, etc. So we have a cut point. There's going to be two regimes in this model. Below pi lower bar, we will have the SIR model happening. And then above pi bar, we're going to have that the passage is no longer linear. It is rising geometrically in proportion to the prevalence. Okay, so this lends itself to a very nice lemma, which is that there's an elasticity of the infection chance and the prevalence, which is constant. And so if you were running, if, for instance, anyone you knew happened to be running a regression of log incidence on log prevalence, you would get a very nice expression there. 1% more prevalence would not, as the epidemiologists say, result in 1% more infections. It would result in only 3% more infections. So we're going to call phi the prevalence elasticity. Let me just point out how this is a very simple, quick, low-hanging fruit here. This shows that size matters for a country shooting ahead to COVID here. So if you have the same number of infected people in Italy and the United States, in Italy, they're going to be producing a much larger infection or prevalence rate. And so the passage rate should be lower. So we're going to see that the bigger countries are going to hit larger thresholds before things start to happen, either at the individual level or at the national level.
Can I ask a question?
Okay.
I'm sorry, I missed, and I'm co-author on this, so I should know, but I missed, why is it that those thresholds you explained earlier, how do they work again? Can you please re-explain?
Oh, so it's important to recognize that
yeah,
there's a model with a corner solution.
Right. Can you go
Okay.
over that? And I think
So-
everybody.
So below, when the prevalence is low enough,
Yeah.
you know that basically the marginal benefit of, even if no one else is washing the hands, the marginal benefit of you inputting 1 ounce of effort into washing your hands is below the marginal cost. And that's the property of this particular hyperbolic function, which you could object to, but it is emerging here. So yeah. But it was entirely because it was a corner solution in the consumer optimization. And those things are always tripping people up on exams, and they are certainly tripping people up here. It tripped me up for a decade. I missed the corner solution for a decade because it turns out the corner solution doesn't matter for all the data analysis. And so I was happy when it was being explained. But there is, at super low levels, we shouldn't expect to see this. And this is a problem here.
And the second, I'm sorry, the second point where things don't go based on, just like in the SIR model, can you explain that too? The
second thing is solve that little game and input the vigilance that we find from the first order conditions into the filter function, and assume that everybody is doing that, and you get that second function. So it came about as a result of the hyperbolic functions. Because I'm short on time, I can't,
Okay.
but the slides are available here. I should point out to my co-authors here, I did not even reveal to them until recently that there was a corner solution. And so that's being manifested here. The corner solution didn't affect our analysis, as I say, but it's a worry there in the background at super low prevalence, which is going to happen for COVID. So I should point out, I've been treating this a little bit, fooling you. I'm doing a static game theory analysis, homogeneous agent, a representative agent model. You can modify this, and the same equilibrium happens if everybody's heterogeneous, if predictor, the heterogeneity comes from a very nice family. I won't do that. You could also see that if this heterogeneity leads to some people with really high losses, like in COVID, old people have high losses, young people have not so high losses, then really probably the best response is to have them meeting in groups by themselves, and you have 2 different contagion equilibria going on, one by the older people, one by the younger people. So there's interesting violations of independence that are suggested here that we're not going to explore. And point out that I've solved only a static optimization, but in a real dynamic setting, if you were perfectly patient and you knew that eventually you were going to succumb to this, then why bother trying? And so this is a very unique game where, as the patience level of the people ramps up, their incentives weaken. And so the only way to explain why people were still kind of pushing forward in Black Death is that they could see beyond the plague, even though it was going to go on for a couple of years. So anyways, there's some very interesting things. But as long as people think that they're going to survive beyond the plague, then even if they're patient, this equilibrium should happen. But that's doing this analysis, dealing with the fact that basically you have endogenous fatalism emerging at high patience has made this very tricky. But we decided not to be fatalistic and just move on ahead. Okay, so what we see here is that if we want to analyze this, we got to worry that there's really 2 dynamics. Suppose you've got an initial seed of people, pi naught. These are people who are seeding the infection. This is typhoid Mary in New York City a century or so ago. This is farmers arriving with swine flu. These are people getting off of airplanes into your country who are infected, likely unwittingly, with COVID-19. That seed is given to the differential equation dynamics. At this point, I'm going to call the model Breakout, okay? Because almost everyone is susceptible, and the dynamics are easier to analyze. The insights are sharper. So a lot of the analysis here comes from Breakout, especially for COVID. The swine flu paper, the Breakout analysis was not enough. Okay, so near Breakout, the SIR dynamics remarkably simplify into a form where you can actually solve for the infection rate, and we know it grows exponentially. Everybody's been talking about exponential growth here. Above that threshold, past that sometime, we're going to pass into the region where people start having vigilance. This is the vigilant regime. At that point, we shift. So let's assume at some point tau lower bar, which might have been around February 1st for us in this pandemic, we shifted into a vigilant regime. Okay, people were aware there's something going on out there. Then we've got the dynamics following this new behavioral SIR dynamics where the infection or the prevalence levels are being raised now, not to the exponent 1 as the SIR model would suggest, but to the exponent phi. Okay, there is an adjustment for the behavioral passage rate due to the Bayes rule effect. So the lead coefficient changes. Normally that first term, pi plus sigma over sigma, that's basically 1 when pi is close to 0. So normally we don't pay attention to it, but it is there. Now let me show you what happens to the dynamics. Okay, and so this starts to explain what happened in past pandemics. I should point out, for instance, that the great pandemic of 1919, the Spanish flu, eventually infected 1/3 of the world. And if you look at the implied R0 for 1/3 of the world, this thing was hardly infectious at all. Bullshit. Okay, so let's see that happening in the dynamics. I've drawn the course of the dynamics for phi equals, the subscripts here are phi, the prevalence elasticity. For phi equals 1, 0.9, and 0.87. And you can see how it radically changes the dynamics. Okay. So in general, we're getting that at the highest prevalence elasticity 1, that's the SIR model, we have a highest herd immunity threshold. And as phi falls and this behavioral component starts to matter more, this filter, the responsiveness to your actions in the filter starts to matter more. As phi falls, the dynamics radically change. Even at 0.87, which by the way, we're gonna be finding today in the data, the eventual number who will succumb is going to change from basically almost everyone for this particular example here to only about 2/3 of people. And so it should come as no surprise then that only 1/3 of the planet got the Spanish flu. And we'll see this for the contagions du jour in this paper. The other thing it does is that this behavioral component naturally flattens the curve, that the peak starts going down. The implied peaks that people are thinking of for this non-behavioral world are just spikes and flashes, and they happen earlier. So the whole model, when this behavioral component is accounted for, ends up delaying and attenuating. And that is what we're going to be seeing in the data. Now, I should point out, this is work in progress, and we're trying to prove this formally, but you can see immediately just from looking at the equations, I've written down the steady state equation for herd immunity, that the herd immunity threshold is going to be, we're going to have more people remaining who are susceptible with phi less than 1. This is a very simple analysis. And so we were going to do a simple comparative statics and also give the time dynamics. So this is work in progress, and some of it's very low hanging fruit and some of it's fun. And by the way, here you can see, here's a very nice plot done kind of more last minute. Thank you, Andrea. And you can see that as phi drops below 1, the herd immunity thresholds start to plummet. And around 0.7, we should only expect maybe 35% of many people to get the disease eventually. So this is major. Okay. So now let's get to the data here. First for the swine flu. So we have data from 41 states. It's either weekly or some of it's daily. There's some states were not giving us data, some on purpose, some because they didn't know what we were doing. But eventually we settled on daily data. It was daily data from a list of states here. And it was enough to get a pretty decent story of what happened in the H1N1 epidemic. And you can see how wonderful is the fit here. So we're gonna look, this, by the way, swine flu, this eventually went to herd immunity. I'm going to get to that in a second. So we can't just do log of incidence on prevalence. We have to scale by the susceptible portion because that's huge. But when you properly scale, you end up estimating that the coefficient is very close to 0.9. And it's a pretty good fit. R² equals 0.76, On the other hand, what would I know? I'm a theorist. Swine flu was interesting. It went to herd immunity. And it was interesting to see the story playing out because the epidemiologists were advising the CDC. And in spring 2009, CDC announces that about 2/3 of Americans would eventually get this. Okay, just like Newsom's announcing 56% of Californians would get this. Eventually, around 61 million Americans, or 19 or 20% of the population, got swine flu. And it turns out that when they got it, at the moment, I'm going to show you in a second, the moment herd immunity hit, there was basically only 15% were immune by infection and 5% were immune by vaccination. So we hit herd immunity at 20%. And swine flu was much more contagious than that, I remember at the time. So behavior mattered. And not only that, you could see it mattered. You can't explain it by seasonal effects. This thing ends up dying away in December at the peak of, or when the flu season is normally starting to ramp up. This thing was dying away. Okay, and I'll just show you here the data. Here was the swine flu epidemic, 2009. And some of this data, my co-authors inform me, is in the possession of no other people on the planet except this Zoom audience. So you can see here superimposed the actual prevalence levels. There was a spring peak. There was a lull in the summer, as often happens for these sorts of flu-y things. And then there was a peak, and it peaked in November. And look what happened when it peaked. Down below is the fraction of the population who were vaccinated. And we around 6% vaccinated. This thing was going away. And just zooming in on that, you can see the amazing fall off. We hit herd immunity and then poof, we starts to fall. So that level can only be understood in light of this sort of theory. Okay, actually you should never say necessity for your theory, but of existing theories. Okay, so now I want to go to the current epidemic, COVID-19. Okay, and there was in high school English class, we learned this work by John Donne, famous quote, "No man is an island unto himself, every man is a part of the continent, a piece of the main, and therefore never send to know for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee." That bell was tolling. He was recalling the Great Plague of 1606, which was very influential for Shakespeare. And every time someone was being carried off during the plague to their demise, the bell was tolling. So I thought it was an interesting metaphor here. Just explaining it in case people were curious. Okay, so we're going to look at the post-breakout analysis for COVID-19. And the post-breakout analysis is important not only because where we are right now and where our data is, but it's also where we will be if we go through this shutdown and lockout. We choke off this thing until some point where there's forced to start opening up the markets, but we know it's still out there. At some level, we're now at breakout again. So this breakout analysis is not only a situation now, it's a situation that's relevant for all of our policy analysis looking forward here. So there's a real question. Is the prevalence so low at the beginning that we're in this nonchalance, this chill phase where we're just on SIR dynamics? That's a question in the background. And I'm going to show you that if you look at the growth rates of COVID from nations, that you can deduce that no, right from basically the point of the data starting to gather, we are seeing our behavioral SIR region operative. Okay, and we're going to see that the growth rates are falling for every nation. So the passage rates are going to be falling because I'm going to give you a theorem here that's going to link the passage rates and the growth rates and show you, gee, not only is it explaining the model, why it's falling, it'll explain how fast it's falling and why it's falling. The other thing that's different about COVID is that we've been talking a lot about people who are asymptomatic and spreading this thing. Some people are not ever going to get sick from this, and they are the silent spreaders, and this totally changes the analysis. So we're going to introduce 3 different states. Essentially, the passage of someone through COVID apparently is that you are first oblivious and non-contagious, then you're oblivious and you're contagious, and then some get sick and some don't. Okay, and this might explain there's huge prevalence in some areas. There's one town in Germany that was just measured 15% have been infected. In Colorado, in the middle of nowhere, a survey said 1 to 3% were infected. And secondly, if you are analyzing the efficacy of testing and tracing, testing people depends entirely upon their information. You know, right now people are being tested based upon them saying, I feel sick. Whereas if you were randomly testing people, you'd be hitting people. Now let's go and do the state analysis here. This is the model, we call it the SI3R model. So there's 3 infected states. And you're going through these 3 information states, which you really need to keep track of. And the 3 information states have their own transition parameters. So there's first some passage rate that you're flowing into the infected state. I'll explain that passage rate in a second, but essentially it responds to how many people who are asymptomatic out there. After around 2.5 days, you are going from state 1 to state 2. You are suddenly becoming contagious. So your exit rate from state 1 is 0.4 per day. And then after another 2.5 days, you're exiting from state 2 when you start to become symptomatic, if you are ever going to, on average. So I'll call that transition psi. And then there's another transition nu. That last stage where you're symptomatic, you're suffering, that can last a while, maybe 12 days. And so there's a smaller exit rate nu from that last stage. Okay, so people are asymptomatic. So in state 3, we're going to merge 2 types of people. So let's just call some fraction alpha asymptomatic, or equivalently, they're cavalier or irresponsible. They're going to be formally the same in the model. And these people, the silent spreaders, are going to ramp up everything and speed up the transition dynamics. So now let's modify the earlier dynamics that we had and say, okay, how fast are the non-contagious infected time bombs growing? That's N. These are the people who in 2.5 days will start becoming contagious. Well, you multiply the susceptible portion sigma times the fraction of people in state CA, in state A, in the state 2, there's a mass CA of people who are infected. This mass of people who are infected is unaware, they're asymptomatic, so they're spreading it at the rate beta. And then we go to the symptomatic state, and everyone except the irresponsible people or the symptomatic people are going to then start spreading it at a lower rate. So essentially we can treat these people as if there's a representative agent model and they're spreading it at rate alpha beta. And then there's an exit at rate kappa, which I said was every 2.5 days, so exit of 0.4. Then the next 2 states are just an automatic pilot. You're just moving, it's just water pouring from one bowl into the next at different rates. And if you wanted to figure out what your R naught was, well, your R naught is how many people you're going to infect. That comes from 2 different states. That comes from being in state 2. And also the people in state 3 who are oblivious. And so that is pumping up the R naught levels for this particular model. Okay, so here's the question. We're at breakout. At breakout, the most obvious thing that's happening here is that all of these states are growing along some balanced growth path. They're all growing at the same rate per day. It turns out that this rate is scary high, okay? So you ask, what is the rate that it's growing at? Well, there's 3 states. It turns out you can solve for the equality here of input equals output for all the 3 states growing at the same rate. And it turns out that there's a cubic equation that governs the growth rate. And we give it here. And if you look at that cubic equation, it is nicely linear in beta, the passing rates. You can actually solve one equation, one unknown for beta. And you can see then how the growth rate allows you to infer in a very linear way what the passing rate is. And here it is. You can see on the horizontal axis, I forgot to label it, is beta, the spreading rate, the passing rate, sorry. On the vertical axis is the growth rate. What I don't know is how many people out there are silently spreading it. So if the number, as the number of people who are silently spreading it changes, this implied growth rate starts to rise. So we've plotted it here for alpha, the fraction being either 0, 0.1, 0.3, 0.5, 0.75, or 1. So growth is worst in this region where there's a lot of silent spreaders out there. Nicely, you can see, by the way, that if you think of formalizing beta as social distancing, because it's the passing rate, that you can see kind of going back, going to from right to left, how much the growth rate falls as a function of beta. And you know that this function here, drawn growth as a function of beta, it looks like it's a concave function, but if you imagine looking at it on its side, you can see that the growth rate is going to be falling at a faster and faster rate as social distancing increases up to some point. This function here turns basically from being convex to concave, but it is down to a pretty low growth rate. This is a concave function visually, and thus there are increasing returns to social distancing. So a nice little bonus. There's no optimization here, but it's a nice bonus of thinking of it. Okay, bottom line. Okay, so we know if we look at the growth rates, we can infer the passage rates. Imagine doing, let's do comparative steady states. So imagine that beta changes, then growth rate should change. So these things they should be tracking each other. Beta doesn't change, growth rate can't change. We see the growth rate falling, passage rate is falling. Okay, so let's look at data. And this is how we were originally looking at the data. We're looking at the data, and this is what a lot of people have been doing. You plot the log cumulative cases, and the log cumulative cases, you can see right from the get-go. Here's Britain. It is, Britain was originally growing at a pretty high rate. The best fit line here, if you do a quadratic, was 29% per day growth, which is pretty scary. But the slope was always falling. You could see you do this country after country, the growth rates are falling, so the passage rates are falling. We are clearly in the behavioral SRIR region. We should matter. By the way, the behavioral SRIR region says that these plots that people are plotting, and they're using quadratics. The quadratic, there's never a constant quadratic that fits the case. So what is the actual plot you should use? And this is just solve the implied dynamics from the behavioral SIR model, and you get something that is very fancy, involves exponentials here, and we're currently using this to fit the incidence data, but it does a pretty good job. So the quadratics are only rules of thumb. There's no theory behind them. Okay. So, and by the way, if you want us to talk about testing or tracing, they are identifying people in these different states. I'll let people look at the slides since I want to get to the data before we get too far into this. Okay, so we're going to look at the analysis of various countries here. We finally decided that yes, the behavioral SIR model was justified using it at this very early stage. So let's start doing the log on log plots. And this is all data that's just up to date as of yesterday. And here's the theory. And you can see the behavioral SIR model is predicting data for country after country. And it works until we hit the point where lockdown happens. What lockdown is doing is that it is changing the game. And in a way that I'm not really quite certain how to think of, but if people say that lockdown or shutdown is just shutting down people's actions, behavior shouldn't matter anymore. Wrong. You can see that behavior does matter in the pictures that we're getting. So Germany was on one trajectory. This is at some level the worst case for all the prevalence elasticity forecasts, and the least consistent with this with the swine flu data. So let me consider Italy. Here was the trajectory Italy was on in this space, this log-log space. It was the estimated prevalence elasticity was 0.81. It certainly is significantly excluding 1. So we clearly had in Italy privately optimal vigilance before the lockdown happened or any of the measures happened that was choking off this contagion and would have choked it off at some level that we can now theoretically predict. And you can see then that post-lockdown, the prevalence elasticity drops to 0.224. Behavior still matters in lockdown. Norway, before the lockdown, the estimated prevalence elasticity, 0.783, significantly far from 1. There's crazy stuff happening after the lockdown. It seems like they've got a pretty good lockdown. We've got a negative slope here. I don't know how to interpret the negative slope, in particular because the cumulative cases starts being the wrong measure there. So I'll get to that in a second. Cumulative cases can only go up. And that was kind of a heuristic for the chance you were being infected. So I'll adapt to that in a second. Let's go through some other countries. Austria, 0.874, significantly, not significantly below 1, but still estimated to be below 1. And post-lockdown, 0.163, behavior still matters in lockdown. Switzerland, wow, Switzerland's kind of an unusual country. I don't understand, it's 0.291. Spain, very nice mapping of the theorem. Estimated prevalence elasticity 0.9, post-lockdown 0.471. So you can see the lockdown basically chokes off the prevalence elasticity. Here it's cutting it in half. Here is the United Kingdom. It was originally on a pretty much of a non-vigilant, close to chill regime, 0.965, until recently, and now the prevalence elasticity has dropped off to 0.69. Sweden was originally 0.934, dropping down after whatever restrictions they put in down to 0.879. So that seems like their restrictions have had the least effect on behavior. So let me get at the fact that the log prevalence is probably not good in lockdown. If cases start falling or weird stuff's happening, you can't use the log cumulatives. It can only go up. So let's start using currently contagious people who got it in the last 17 days, and start doing these. And now you can see, look, here's New Zealand. It was going up fine, and then suddenly they just had an amazing lockdown. Again, it's almost, during lockdown, it's almost as if we've got some sort of GIF and good going on. So I need to understand what sort of consumer behavior would be consistent with that falling. Germany, 0.89. Again, there's a story that emerges across countries that the prevalence elasticity is below 9, but pretty close to it. Austria, 0.76. And Switzerland, when we do it with currently contagious, 0.784. Okay, so now the picture starts to get better. Spain, 0.843. So we can see that the responsiveness for COVID is a little bit more than for swine flu here. US was at 0.936 until some set of states had lockdowns. We're going to call it March 22nd, and then it goes down to 0.481. So again, the lockdown seems to cut this elasticity in half. And just at the as we're getting towards the end here, I just thought I'd put in evidence that we found that people are being vigilant. And this is before any lockdowns have happened. That here's people's reservations on OpenTable for restaurants, and it was just collapsing from February through March. Here's the city of San Francisco and Washington, and here's the state of Georgia, and 2 other places I unfortunately cropped their names off of here. Bottom line, this is all a work in progress. We're looking, we didn't understand when I was dealing with this one set of co-authors on the swine flu, we didn't really treat the problem as a dynamic problem. And we were just treating this cross-sectionally. This story is unfolding dynamically, and so we've kind of pushed the SIR model in a dynamic direction and are finding dynamic equations for what these paths should be. And these dynamic equations, as I say, are best illustrating the point that Anthony Fauci made the other week. I think it was just a few days ago, I saw this quote. He said, I heard it on NPR, models are as good as the assumptions you put into them. And as we get more data, and then you put that in, and it might change. And those are the types of models, if your models start changing in real time because of data that are happening day by day, that's the quadratic slope model. That's not a model, okay, as economists would say. So the lesson of this paper, just stop using the SIR model for human pandemics. It's wrong. And it's wrong in a way that is going to give you 100% error on the end game. It's going to give you big mistakes on the beginning. Secondly, I should point out, we've looked at these case counts we were trying to do the prevalence elasticity calculation using death data. And then we were trying to match things up. We still haven't succeeded in that because we've realized that if you use the current deaths, and for instance, use the suggestion from the Diamond Princess that there's a 1% death rate, and the fact that it takes around 18 days to die, then you can look at the current deaths in, say, the United States, back to how many cases there were around 18 days ago. And you can see that there is a massive undercount. There's about a 10-fold undercount of the COVID cases in the United States right now. So it is much scarier than we're being led to believe. It's something of the order, not 0.1%, but 1% or more. And those surveys I gave are attesting that fact. So whatever, this is a case where data is really bad and it's being it's misleading people. And the other point is that this testing ultimately can save a lot of lives. You know, everybody, if we are far from the point where we're eventually going to end up, you know, if eventually we're going to have 3 times as many cases, then every infection now is seeding 2 new infections. So if you get tested, somehow you're saving 2 other people potentially from getting infected. And I should point out, in thinking of how this plays out, because you can use this SI3 model to start figuring out, okay, how effective would testing be? It's going to hit people in different states, states 2 and 3, depending on whether it's random or not. Or tracing, if you trace someone, you can hit people in state 1 before they infected other people. So you can do that sort of policy analysis. And I'm thinking this should impact where we're going to. And in this end game, people, I can imagine, would be certified if they have antibodies for this thing, so they're kind of able to get into any setting. But we should be having tests that are officially, you know, this COVID test would allow you to get into the airport. It would have to be something you've gotten in the last 24 hours, say, to get into a large setting. I was thinking about crowds. If you have N people in a crowd, you're roughly going to meet with square root N of them. And so depending upon the size of the event you get into, there should be a square root rule. And after maybe 7 days, these things should be expiring. Because if you look, there would be no value to a test from 7 days ago. So I guess I'm at I didn't really know how fast I'd be going, but I've hit the 3 minutes to go point. So maybe we can shift on to your other phase of this talk.
Yes, thank you, Lonis. That was a great presentation. Just to remind everybody about what happens in the Q&A session. If you're an attendee and you want to ask a question, please raise your hand. I will see you. I will allow you to talk, but then you have to unmute yourself. Otherwise, we will not be able to hear you. So after I've allowed you to talk, please unmute yourself. And actually, Andra again has the first question. Andra, you are permitted to talk, so please ask your question. Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks so much for coming out with this. This is super interesting research. I realized you guys have been working on this before COVID-19 hit, but it's very exciting, and I learned a lot from your talk. I'm wondering, we saw, I think it was yesterday, a paper showing also an endogenous SIR model. This is the Rebello and Eichenbaum and Trevant paper, where in their model, the way people do also take voluntary actions to reduce their risk of infection by consuming and working less. And so I'm sort of wondering where, I think both of them are assuming full information in the sense, and I'm very sympathetic to your emphasis that we need more information about infection rates. But I'm wondering, where do the models differ in terms of policy implications, and how, what are the big differences we should be thinking about?
I wasn't there yesterday. I'm pretty certain that he was probably just using the SIR model and then showing, if this is the model, how I should then respond, adjust my behavior. Think of this model here, by the way, is not really economics per se. I'm trying to modify the epidemiological model and make good forecasts. And I haven't spoken at all on, except towards the end, on the cost-benefit analysis, on what production should happen, what consumption should happen, et cetera. But I am 100% certain that he was using the SIR model at the end of the day. So that would be I don't know how far he was using it in, like, was he using it at low prevalence? Was he using it at high prevalence? At high prevalence, it's going to be completely outrageously misleading.
Actually, Jonas, I have a follow-up on Andre's question. And the way the SIR model was used yesterday was to sort of map, the evolution of the number of infected, susceptible, and recovered, and so on. But there was a feedback mechanism from the level of the aggregate level of economic activity to then, the infection rate. And sort of following up on Andrea's question, so in your setting, which is a game theoretic ones, you have the strategic interaction between agents, which is, if everybody is being vigilant, I have a little bit less of an incentive to be vigilant personally. In that model yesterday, that was a macro model. So there was an externality, which is, I don't internalize what the value of consuming less or working less, will be, in terms of reducing the infection. So there's this sort of difference between, private benefits versus aggregate or, game-wide, benefits from taking actions that affect the spread of the disease. So, which in some sense it's similar, but in some sense it's different. So I sort of wanted to ask you about this as well. So, the sense in which the strategic interaction, could be similar to an externality, in the sense in which it's actually completely different. So what is your take on that?
It's a game of strategic substitutes, and it's a game of positive externality. So undeniably, there is underinvestment. Private vigilance is underinvested, and that would be the case that economists could make for why lockdown should happen, because they are increasing something, vigilance, which is a public good. So I showed you that basically because other people are vigilant, it makes me more lax.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, so we've not pursued the side of this, which is the normative side. That was originally a long time ago when Ellen and I presented at Penn. We were thinking of the standard theory-minded approach of here's what actually happens, here's what should happen, let's do the tax. And so our thought here was, let's just do the positive analysis, let's figure out what actually is happening. But yes, there is undeniably, you can do normative analysis here, and you can see in any game of strategic substitutes, if there is an external benefit, then there's underinvestment in that action.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks. So if there are no more questions on the floor, I also have a follow-up questions along these lines. When I'm thinking about modeling individual agent behavior, how could we think about incorporating social or peer pressure into, for example, being vigilant? Is that just a matter of modeling preferences, or could you actually endogenously model, pressure coming from a subgroup in the population that influences you in this kind of setting?
So if you look at the game, the payoffs, there's a payoff, which is your loss from vigilance, which is just subtractive. And then there's a payoff which is the cost of getting the disease. But you could just add in another cost, which would be social, and keep it in the quasi-linear framework. And that would capture that. If in fact you didn't like being disapproved of by your neighbors, you would like to be out playing basketball, but you hate your neighbors hating you, then you could modify it that way, I guess.
Okay.
Yes. I was very eager to keep the model so that it eventually would look like something an epidemiologist would use.
Yes, for sure. So if I'm waiting for more questions on the floor.
I could ask a question. Yeah, I didn't understand the country size effect that you mentioned earlier on.
Okay, so take I'm saying a given number of people. The disease is transpiring not proportional to population. We know it's transpiring person to person. So it's just the numbers that are growing, okay? So you think, well, then the population shouldn't matter. But the population does matter, because if you take, say, Italy with 100,000 infected people and the USA with 100,000 infected people, well, that's going to produce 1/5 of the prevalence here as in Italy. And thus, using the prevalence elasticity, it's going to produce a much higher spreading rate here, or passage rate here. So I would think that.
But is this about like density or networks between the population? Because otherwise it doesn't.
Not even density. The density is happening, I think, elsewhere. I think that density naturally impacts. I think it impacts the infectiousness, the zeta coefficient. I don't think it impacts anywhere else. But I'm saying that if you just ask, what is the prevalence that we perceive in the population of a country? Let's ignore the fact that maybe they're all in New York City and San Francisco. We don't have to worry about that. But it would just fix a city. Suppose you're talking about 1,000 people who are infected in New York City versus 1,000 people who are infected in Madison. You're going to have hypervigilance in Madison because the prevalence now is going to be much higher. Taking those 1,000 people divided by the population of Madison, 300,000, that's 1 in 300. Doing it for New York City is much smaller. So we should expect that those 1,000 people will be spreading much faster in New York City because the people will be less, and this is something that SIR model does not have, the people will be less vigilant there than here, more lackadaisical. And so this should also be appearing in the data, that the numbers alone are not telling the stories that you need to understand the populations of the countries. And it's not a fair comparison to say, well, we're where Italy was at this point, because, well, here's where Italy wasn't at this point. Italy wasn't with a population of 350 million people. So anyways, bigger countries better for many things, more hospitals, et cetera, but it's worse because it produces more lackadaisical, less vigilant behavior.
Okay, thank you. So Marco Bassetto, you're permitted to talk if you can unmute yourself.
Okay, yep. So I wanted to follow up with what Morten was saying. So the key question there is, what is a country? So for instance, in the US, it's very clear that, being in New York City and being in Minnesota is completely different. So I don't know that the size of the country per se is relevant. I do understand that it's a prevalence in whatever is the relevant unit, and that presumably has to do with the network, but that's the kind of metric that we should try to be using.
Yeah, so whatever is the pool of people that you tend to be matching in. The one thing is also, for these small countries, the same number of people getting off the airplane with the infection is going to have a much larger effect too. And I think that's why the data early on for a lot of these countries is very messy, because it was basically, we're having random seeds dropping everywhere of people getting off of planes or cars or trains. But now that we've, one definition I was thinking of what is a country is that people can still travel around freely and still spread it freely. And once they've, I don't know what's happened in Europe, but in the United States, there's very few people getting in or out of the United States. And some states, even around the tri-state area, are making it hard for people in the tri-state area to get out. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you, Marco. So Giancarlo, you can speak. Can you ask your question? Thanks.
Thank you. One question I have, one of the big unresolved issues is what happened when the lockdown is lifted or relaxed. Do you have, I think you mentioned something, but could you elaborate a little bit on that? Because in a way there could be a memory, of the past, there could be a memory of the initial phase of the disease. So how would the game help us understanding what would be the reaction of people once strict measures are relaxed?
Fauci said that we should never go back to shaking hands again, which I thought was a little bit weird. But I think that you should imagine vigilance is something that you have to expend mental effort to do. Or maybe if you're canceling meetings, you have to expend other effort to do. So if you were to actually have gotten into a habit of, well, God forbid, not wearing a mask, but cleaning your hands some more. Maybe it's just now you were a lifetime non-hand washer and now you're a hand washer. If that's now your default, that's no longer costly vigilance. So I think that the longer term impact of this is that there'll be a higher baseline of just vigilance that'll stop passing without it being an expense. By the way, as I said, the whole point of the paper was to do analysis that would work for post-lockout, because once we go to post-lockout, then we're starting off this game again. And so I'm hoping that this could help explain the efficacy of different things there. But I'm hoping that we'll have at least an understanding that this thing could start ramping up. And I think that there's 2 lessons of the paper. A, the end games are not as dire, but B, the numbers we can compute that in order to actually keep the R naught at least 1 is fantastically hard. We started doing the computations, and we would have to have an amazing, what testing and tracing does is it starts knocking out people in these state 1 and 2. And if you can knock out enough of them, then you can hold the R naught down to 1 or less. And that's the only hopeful end game, enough testing and tracing to hold the R naught down to 1 or less.
So Marco has another question, but I wanted to ask you clarification on the lockdown, because most experts are saying that once we start, relaxing the lockdown, it's a concrete possibility that there will be another lockdown, later, if there's a resurgence in the infection rate. So in the game, how do we think about that? Because I think it's fair to say that at least in the United States, in the first 2 weeks where we did see, some endogenous, vigilance, as the open table data, I think very few people were expecting a lockdown like we have now, even if it already happened, in China and to some degree in Italy. And I think now people understand the consequences of that, much better. Does
so what
that
do you
change the
think?
game?
What's your question? Like post-lockdown, what you think people will be wary of the next lockdown happening again? So be naturally more vigilant?
Yeah, that could be, hopefully, that might be one of the outcomes. But how do I think about, so the next lockdown? Because that is a possibility. I think, I think policymakers are very clear that, we could expect that if there's a resurgence.
Right. And this is the political economy, and that's really hard to predict. I'm desperately hoping that we don't ever get to another lockdown after this. And the way they do it is this massive testing and tracing.
Mm-hmm.
If we don't go, any country that doesn't go to national testing and tracing is just committing economic insanity.
Yeah.
Because you're ensuring another lockdown.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree with that, but I'm not sure. So Marco, go ahead. Marco?
Sorry, are you referring to me? I lowered
Yes.
my hand. I forgot to lower my hand.
Okay. So does anybody have any new questions? If you already asked a question, you can unraise your hand unless you have a new one. No more questions?
Serdar Özkan,
Yes, there you go. Hi.
So does seeing what has happened in Italy make Americans more vigilant, if not the US government, do you think? Like, does your model have any implications for that?
Well, obviously Italy was a canary in the coal mine for everyone. So I think that anything that changes your perception of the prevalence, and for instance, right now, I would like us to publicize the fact that the prevalence is not 1 in 1,000, that it's over 1 in 100. I think in the United States right now, there's somewhere between 3 and 5 million infected walking around. And if people were aware of this, it would radically change their actions. So I think that, yeah, seeing what goes on in other countries makes you aware that the prevalence is higher and causes you to be more vigilant, even from a purely, the whole behavioral SIR model is purely selfishly optimal vigilance.
So Giancarlo, did you have another question?
Not really. No, on the lockdown, maybe. Am I on?
Yes, you're on.
No. So the question I think Stefania and I were trying to ask is, after the lockdown is relaxed, would the memory of, would the vigilance be high enough? Maybe because some costs have become less of a cost because we get used to that. Or like people, in any case, behave differently. Would the vigilance be a contribution to avoid another lockdown? No? You immediately say that we need to go to this testing and tracing big time. I agree with that. But the point is that would behavior be, I'm not saying enough, but at least a contribution to reduce the risk of another resurgence, no, or the resurgence of the disease.
Right. So this is, and we have not, we need to do some dynamic analysis on low prevalence. It seems like what the lockdown is doing is it's formally the same thing as lowering this prevalence elasticity, dropping it below 1/2. So the question is, if this kind of becomes more of a behavioral norm, then what is the implications for the dynamics there? And we haven't. We were just doing some dynamic analysis just even last night, and it seems that when the prevalence elasticity drops low enough, in fact, even at 0.8 and 0.7, we're getting really strange dynamics. So we need to do that. We were only estimating before for the range we were at around 0.9. And even around 0.9, this had huge implications. But yeah, we need to solve the dynamic analysis for low prevalence elasticities that are nonetheless positive. I think it could be that could be enough to keep this thing at bay. So that's our kind of on our to-do list.
Okay, great. I think Kurt has a question.
Hi, Linus, thanks. I just had one question about thinking about the dynamics of it. So far you've considered that the loss is basically constant over time. But one of the things that's kind of being pushed is that we have hospital constraints. So it seems like the loss really depends on kind of the set of people that are currently infected. And so you can see how you can get these perverse incentives that if, when you have people that are patient, and if you think that you're, with high probability you're eventually going to get it, then you have an incentive to get it early as opposed to late. And have you thought about how that would change? Right? No, right? I mean, I talked about this with my colleagues, right? If I have no underlying conditions, then maybe it's good to get it now instead of getting it when things are peaking and hospitals are destroyed. But clearly that is going to push, it's going to have a perverse timing effect on the individual incentives for vigilance that it potentially could have greater externalities in terms of the infection rates. I don't know if you guys have thought about that or just.
You're asking almost a reverse dynamic question of fatalism. That instead of I'm eventually going to get it, so why bother trying now? To I don't want to get it later, better to get it sooner, so might as well not try now. So, do you think that that's actually on people's minds, that if they were to get COVID in 1 month, that they might die with a higher chance?
I've certainly discussed it with other economists. I don't know, maybe just economists think about that, but.
You have more grim conversations than I do.
No, actually, this is an argument I use with my, parents all the time.
Right now, don't die later.
Well, because the hospital system in Italy is really, at this point straining. So it's a particularly bad time, not to comply with the not going out rule and
Mom, Dad, party tonight. Let me suggest.
So no, I think this is relevant. I think people, certainly if you look at the communications of policymakers in the media going from, let's look at, the newest state governor Cuomo, he's been really trying to explain, what would happen, to the hospital system if people don't comply. And then if you're an individual that rationalizes the effects on you of possibly getting the disease, you would take that information into account because there has been an effort to communicate that clearly. And so I think, it's something that people, not just economists, but more broadly, I think people consider that at different points in the epidemic, the cost of becoming infected might differ. I'm not sure how much we can sort of think about people rationally sort of plotting out a whole SIR model about this, but I think
right,
sort of
and
understanding.
That's the point, though. That I think I gave you the plots for the peak of the incidence, the peak of the deaths would be like that. these plots and these forecasts have all been based on the wrong model.
Mhm.
And they're forecasting much higher peaks than we'll eventually get. They're forecasting them earlier than we would get them. So everything attenuates and flattens when you have these incentives. So I don't see the same dire end game. I have no desire to get this, and I'm desperately hoping that we treat it very seriously. But I don't see the hospital system entirely breaking because people are rational.
And I think some of the evidence even coming out of New York, where this week they're needing less ventilators than they thought they would need, sort of is somewhat supportive of what you're saying. As a last question, I think if nobody in the audience has any more questions that I wanted to ask you, I know that the model that you've looked at for today doesn't have groups per se, but you said something fascinating about potentially allowing for group heterogeneity and having different equilibria prevailing in different groups. So if I'm hanging out with people at high risk, say older people, I have one level of vigilance, and if I'm hanging out with young people, I have a different level of vigilance. How would I, generate this kind of segmentation or segregation across groups? So do you have any intuition,
Definitely. So we analyzed a representative agent model, and then we went and we redid the analysis for a heterogeneous agent model where there's a reverse gamma distribution. If it turns out with the reverse gamma distribution of losses, you end up getting the same formula emerging identically. And so but then you think, wow, okay, so we were making an independence assumption before, but it didn't really matter because we're just saying kind of random whether you meet someone who's susceptible or not. But now the independence assumption starts to really matter because maybe you know that there are high loss and low loss individuals. And so the way of solving this externality that we're talking about, that you underinvest in effort, is literally to segregate people by losses. And I think that that's what we're seeing with the stores. They understand that there's two different games going on out there. My guess is that we're gonna, at the very end, when they do the antigen test, they're gonna find out that many more of the youth are gonna be COVID positive than the older people.
That's just highly likely just in terms of the interactions that people have, right?
Yeah.
So there's one question, and it may be our final one from Marco. Marco, go ahead.
I have one more on the perverse incentives. So your suggestion that we're going to go to a massive testing scheme in which essentially if you have the antibodies, you're home free, and otherwise you have to be tested every few days to pretty much do anything, is going to generate potentially a lot of perverse incentives. And so that's something that, policymakers would need to think about.
For instance, I mean, suppose, right now there is the Metropolitan Opera. They're holding an opera tonight, and as part of the admission, they also demand that you've passed a COVID test in the last 48 hours. That would be just the Metropolitan Opera saying, this is our rule.
But if you have the antibodies, then you don't have to take the test.
Correct. And so we're going to have to deal with falsification of identity, et cetera. This is why this thing needs to be thought out now, because they need there's inevitably going to be counterfeit IDs on this. So they need to have something that is solid. I don't know what they're going to have that's believable. I imagine they're going to be opening schools this fall, and probably the schools, they're going to have two sets of classrooms. There'll be virtual students, and if you can prove that you're home free, then you can come to a class, but they're probably not going to do large classes. And this, I was talking about the square root rule. Our university was talking about making the principal's classes virtual because they tend to be the large classes, and the upper level classes in real life. But yeah, I would think that the risk level with a crowd rises as the square root of the size of the crowd. So I think this should be kind of filtering into risk considerations.
Yeah. Okay, so thank you. If there are no more questions, I think we can close the session. Thanking Lonas very much for his presentation and the discussion, and all the co-authors for answering the questions. And I guess we will see you next week in the next seminar on Tuesday. Thank you very much. Thank you, Lonas.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, just to remind everyone, if you've registered for this seminar, you will get a reminder of next Tuesdays. There's no need for further registrations. We've now set this up as a recurring webinar, so you will get a reminder if you would like to come. It would be great to have you there. And this will be true for all of the future VMACS seminars. So we have 3 next week, again, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. So we hope to see you all there.
Thanks.
Have a happy Easter Passover weekend for everyone.